Hi class, it's Mr. Fiore. Today, while I'm on retreat again, you're going to listen to my voice as you take notes on the rest of the material in Chapter 7, Section 1, and we are also going to begin Section 2 today. Please do not forget that tomorrow we are going to have a quiz on Chapter 7, Section 1, the beginnings of Rome. You should have started studying already. Today, at the end of class, you may have some time to study for the quiz as well. If you miss any of the notes today or had trouble seeing the notes, or you didn't listen to anything I said because I sound boring, you can log on to my website tonight and view the presentation. Tomorrow, when I'm in class, you will have the opportunity to ask any questions that you may have on the material we covered today. If you have not done so already, please take out your notebooks and turn to where we left off yesterday. Today we are going to begin talking about how the Romans were shrewd rulers, and yesterday, I think in each one of the classes, we talked about what the word shrewd meant. It means mentally sharp or clever. The Romans had the ability to understand things and make good judgments. They weren't just this disciplined army that was able to march in and conquer all of Europe, North Africa, and basically exert their authority. The Romans were clever because in every settlement that they conquered, they established a presence in their military. They built permanent military settlements in areas they conquered. Once they've done that, they built roads connecting all of the cities that they conquered and all their military settlements. The roads allowed troops to travel swiftly to any place in their territory. The Romans started to conquer a lot of different groups of people, and they wanted to rule their new conquest, the people that they conquered. So the Romans created the Roman Confederation. Don't forget to underline everything that's in bold today, or if I underline it in your presentation or anything that's italicized, just make sure you underline or highlight. You should have your highlighters on you. Now, what the Roman Confederation was, it was a system where the Romans offered full citizenship to some people they conquered, especially other Latins. We talked about the Latins, how historians believe they were the first people to originate in the city of Rome and around the city of Rome. They offered them full citizenship, meaning that they could vote, they could serve in the government, and they were treated the same as other citizens under the law. This Roman Confederation is very similar to the citizenship test that we have here in our country. When immigrants come to our country, they have the opportunity to gain a U.S. citizenship by taking a test and becoming a U.S. citizen and having the same rights that citizens have in voting and serving in the military, all the freedoms that we have. Immigrants could obtain by taking the citizenship test. Right? And the Romans created this in 300 BC. Right? So they came up with kind of a citizenship test long before we did. The Romans also granted other people around them the status of allies. Allies were people that were allowed to run their own local affairs, but they had to have some loyalty to the Republic, the government that existed in Rome. They had to pay taxes to the Roman Republic, and they also had to provide soldiers for the armies. And the Romans made it clear that their loyal allies could improve their position and even become Roman citizens. So, with these policies, the Romans proved themselves to be pretty clever rulers. And they knew that conquered people would be more loyal to the government if they were treated well. So they thought that this Roman Confederation and establishing allies was fair. and the Romans' generosity paid off. As a result, the Republic grew stronger and stronger, and it became even more unified. All the same, Rome was still not afraid to use force if necessary. If conquered people tried to revolt against the Roman rule, their resistance was swiftly put down, and they were successful in doing that because they had military settlements in almost every city and a roadway leading to almost every city, which would allow legions to get from city to city swiftly. This slide is the last slide for Chapter 7, Section 1. So you want to make sure you study up to here. So make sure you study. Alright, study to here. I don't know if it's going to fit, but alright, make sure you study to here if you want to make note of that. Star it or write that in. Something that stands out so you know where you have to study up to for the quiz tomorrow. So, Chapter 7, Section 2, the Roman Republic. In this section, we are going to focus on how Rome's republic was shaped by a struggle between wealthy landowners and regular citizens, and how it gradually grew to improve. Also in this section, we're going to talk about how Rome basically becomes the leading power in Italy by 100s BC. All right. So make sure you get the section title down, and we're going to move on. Okay, before we talk about the structure of the Roman Republic and how the government worked, we're going to talk about kind of the two groups of people that existed early in the Republic. Before you start copying everything down, I suggest if you have a new page to maybe create a chart for this slide. So if you want to put class divisions of early Rome up top, then patricians, and make a little T chart, and then plebeians on the other side. However you want to do it, or you can just copy down for patricians. We'll start talking about who the patricians are, and then we'll work our way to the plebeians. All right. This slide is important. All right, it's important to understand the differences between these two groups and how the Romans were divided early on. The patricians. The word patrician comes from a Latin word for father, patres. All right, so you're learning some Latin already here in 6th grade. And in 509 BC, when the Romans established a republic and overthrew the last Etruscan ruler, Tarquin the Proud, the patricians were the ones that rebelled and established a republic, and noble patricians considered themselves privileged and better capable of ruling. So, in the early days of the republic, pretty much all governmental positions were held by patricians. Patricians were the wealthy landowners. They made up the ruling class, and there was only a minority of patricians. They did not make up the majority of the people. There was about maybe 5% of the people in Rome were patricians. They were considered Roman citizens. They did have the right to vote. They had to pay taxes, and patricians did serve in the army as well. All right. The patricians also believed that only certain people were born to lead and others were destined to follow. They saw themselves as the people that were born to lead. They basically thought they were more entitled. And the plebeians, even there's more of them, they're not part of this elite class. They basically claim to have special knowledge of the gods, and therefore they kind of serve as a disciple of their gods. And they have the authority to punish anyone that offends their knowledge and their rules. All right, the plebeians eventually kind of grew tired of this idea these patricians had, and we'll talk about that. Make sure you highlight and know that they are the wealthy landowners. They are the minority of the population in Rome, and the rights, the responsibilities they had as Roman citizens. In the chapter on Greece, we talked about the idea of how they created the first idea of citizenship, and there are certain responsibilities that they had as citizens. So now moving on to plebeians. The plebeians made up most of Rome's people. However, they had less social status. They also were the most diverse group. There was a lot of the plebeians had a lot of different responsibilities within this republic. Some of them were artisans, some of them were shopkeepers, some of them were actually landowners, just of only small farms. The word plebeian comes from the Latin word plebs, and plebs mean many, and it makes sense because there were many plebeians, because there about 95% of the people in early Rome was part of this very diverse group. So make sure you know that they made up the majority, right, of Rome's people. That's the difference between plebeians and patricians. You may want to make note of that. Right? And another similarity that the plebeians had is they did have the right to vote. They did have to pay taxes, and they did serve in the army. And the plebeians made up a large portion of a legion because there's more of them than there are patricians. But a big difference between the plebeians and patricians was that the plebeians had a less social status. In the early days of the Republic, marriage was forbidden between the two classes. So, even if you're a plebeian boy and you're in love with the patrician women, it was forbidden. It wasn't allowed early on in the Republic. If they wanted to run away, maybe they could get married. But within the Roman Republic, they could not get married. Marriage was forbidden between the two classes. And plebeians could not hold political office. They could not serve in the government, or in any part, which we're going to talk about in the next few slides. All right, so make sure you get all this down, and then we're going to move on. Make sure you highlight, pretty much the big difference between plebeians and patricians down here. All right, what's bolded and underlined. All right, make sure you highlight. Know that they had less social status. Okay, we're now going to get into the structure of the Roman Republic. How did Rome's government work? The Roman Republic was a tripartite government, meaning that it had three parts. There was one group that ran the government. All right, they're basically administrators. All right, kind of like how we have a principal of the school, we have a dean of the school, we have an assistant principal, we have an athletic director. All right, they kind of carry out the policies of the school. And the group that ran the government in the Roman Republic were called consuls. All right, you want to write that in on this line here, consuls. I just want to make sure I'm spelling it right. Consuls. All right, consuls. All right, the consuls were responsible for running the government, and there were two of them. And both were patricians, and they were chosen every year. We'll talk about a little bit more on next slide. The other part, so part 2, was a group that made the laws. All right, and the second part was basically, I'm going to write that in, the Senate. All right, the Senate. All right, they were responsible for making the laws. So that goes there. And then there was another group that was responsible for serving as judges, basically. They made judgments on laws. They were very important officials, and they were called praetors. All right, praetors. Praetors. Make sure you fill that in on the line. And some reasons why the Roman Republic was successful for a long time was that it had checks and balances, so that one group could not get too strong. We have checks and balances in our government today. The president can't ever become basically a dictator because of Congress, or it has certain powers that the president doesn't have, and Same thing with the judiciary branch, right? But I don't want to get you confused talking about our government. You'll learn about that next year. But we'll talk about how there were checks and balances in the Roman Republic in the next few slides. The Roman government did not separate powers, all right, like our government. Our government separates powers, meaning that there's only certain powers the president has, certain powers Congress has, and certain powers that the judicial branch has. Right? There's no separation of powers in the Roman Republic. Make sure you get everything down on this slide. All right. The image there is just an image inside of a Roman Senate, right, in the bottom right-hand corner, and it looks like there's a debate going on or conversation. On this slide here, we're going to get into the structures of the Roman Republic. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the consuls, the Senate, and the praetors. First, let's focus on the consuls. There were 2 consuls that were chosen every year, and they were in charge of the Republic. They were 2 patricians early on in the Republic. All right, patricians were the only ones who could serve as these 2 consuls. Consuls were also in charge of heading the army, all right, and running the government. They were military leaders and administrators of the government. Know that they're chosen each year. And one check and balances that existed in the Roman Republic is that the consuls, each consul could veto each other's decision. So let's say one of the consuls wants to go to war. The other one does not. They both had to agree. If they wanted to maybe declare war, they both had to agree in order to find a reason to go to war. If they wanted to pass a law, they both had to agree. So if one vetoed the other, then the law would not be passed, or they would not go to war. They both had to agree. So veto, know what veto means? It is a key term that you're going to define tonight in your homework for reading Chapter 8, Section 2, and defining the key terms. Veto basically means to deny or reject the other's decision. The word for veto is Latin for I forbid. Another important official of the Roman Republic were the praetors. And they were basically officials that were responsible for interpreting laws and acting as judges in court. So if you committed a crime, you went on trial, the praetors would give your sentence, whether it be, if you did a serious crime such as murder, maybe it would be the death penalty or a fine. They were the ones that kind of gave the sentence for court case or the trial. The third part of the Roman Republic was the legislative body. A legislative body is a group of people that have the power to make and form laws. That was known as the Senate. All right, the Senate. We have a Senate today. All right, so maybe we call one house of our Congress the Senate after the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic had a Senate long before we did. And they probably had some of the most power in the Roman Republic. There were 300 senators. In the early days, it was all patrician men. Only patrician men could serve in the Roman Republic. And they would be chosen for life. So once you were chosen into the Senate, you'd be part of it for life. They were responsible for advising the consuls early on in the Republic. Eventually, the Senate does gain the power to make and form laws. So any one of the senators has the power to present a law, and then it could eventually get passed. And they handled the daily problems of the government. So if there was an issue going on within the Roman Republic, they kind of tried to deal with it. Right. And it was probably the most important lawmaking body within the Roman Republic. And over time, the Senate's power is going to grow and grow. And by the 200s BC, that's when they started proposing laws, having debates, approving of building programs. And we'll talk about another legislative body on the next slide, which is basically responsible for electing the consuls and the praetors, because we'll talk about how you would be able to obtain those positions in the Roman Republic. All right, I'll leave the slide up for another maybe 5 seconds or so for those slow writers, and we'll move on. Don't forget to highlight or underline. So another legislative body in the Roman Republic that would be responsible for electing the two consuls and the praetors, and they would also have the ability to pass and vote on laws, was the Assembly of Centuries. Early on in the Republic, it was controlled by patricians. Eventually, later on, the Assembly of Centuries included patricians and plebeians. Right? Did eventually include patricians and plebeians. On this slide, we're going to talk about how the plebeians eventually gained a say in the government, because eventually, as you might expect, plebeians complained about having such little power in the Roman Republic. After all, they fought alongside with the patricians in the army. They had to pay taxes, so they helped the Republic thrive, and they were basically tired of giving money to the Republic and not having any say, and they serve in the army and not having any say. Right? So, imagine how would you feel as an American citizen if you had to serve in the army, or you served in the army and you had to pay taxes, but you didn't get to vote, or you weren't allowed to own a certain amount of property, or you weren't allowed to marry whoever you wanted. Right? You probably would get pretty upset. Right? And in 494 BC, the plebeians are going to take action. They're going to bring about change. They went on strike. They're going to refuse to serve in the army, and that greatly hurt the army because the plebeians made up the majority of the army. And they're going to try and leave the city. They threatened to leave the city and set up a republic of their own. The patricians kind of got frightened by this, and they kind of agreed to share them in power. However, there was a little bit of a rebellion that took place within the Roman Republic for some years. And finally, in 471 BC, the plebeians were allowed to set up their own body of representatives, called the Council of Plebs. The Council of Plebs was the assembly that they set up, which is right here. You don't really need to know the name of the assembly, but it's in your textbook, and I'm just sharing it with you now. And basically, this assembly was responsible for electing tribunes. And the tribunes become a very important part of the Republic as it grew. And these tribunes were people who would bring about plebeian concerns to the Republic. They'd bring it to the attention of the Senate or the consuls. And eventually, the tribunes also win the right to veto government decisions by the Senate or other offices. Finally, in 287 BC, the Council of Plebs, which is that assembly that elected tribunes, were allowed to pass laws. So it took hundreds of years before these plebeians gained kind of an equal say in the government as the patricians. And then finally, in 455 BC, in 455 BC, so in between that time period where the assembly gained that full ability to pass laws, plebeians and patricians were allowed to marry. That law was changed. Make sure you get this entire slide down. Alright, this is going to be the last slide for today. We're going to stop here. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Roman government and how it worked. The Roman Republic is going to become more representative, but it was far from a full-fledged democracy. You saw that in the early days, how plebeians did not have a say in the government. But there was class division of slaves that existed in the Roman Republic, and some people that the Romans conquered did not have all the same rights that citizens had. So it wasn't a full-fledged democracy, and we'll talk about some other aspects of the Republic, because there is an unusual feature of the Roman Republic where there was an office of a dictator, and we'll get into that on Thursday after the quiz. All right. Please don't forget to study for the quiz tomorrow, and also for homework tonight. If the sub has not told you already, you're reading Chapter 8, Section 2 in the textbook and defining the key terms. Make sure you do that cautiously and accurately. And make sure you have the correct amount of terms for that section. All right. Again, if you missed any of the notes, you can watch this presentation again on my website. I wish all of you a very great day. Thank you.